Hello, good afternoon. My name is Bo Woods and I am your MC for this session. Hopefully everybody got a chance to enjoy a little bit of lunch. If not, hope you get a chance to enjoy some lunch later today. Make sure you take care of yourselves. It is a long week. You gotta pace yourselves, drink water, get coffee if you need it, and fill your bellies with some delicious food. I would like to remind you all that you get some free socks today just by filling out the survey form. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. If you wanted to see less of me, let RSA know. Make sure that everybody knows what's up. Next up, we have a fantastic panel on builders and breakers. Some really, really exciting work that's gone on in the election security space in the last few years. Getting away from a lot of the overhyped things that you might see in the press, getting to more substantive real truth and making true change. So I will invite up the moderator for this, Executive Director of the IT ISAC, Scott Algier. Scott, you want to come on up? All right, give a hand to Scott. And I will hand it over to you to welcome the rest of the panel.
Yeah, very great, thank you, Bo, appreciate that. Again, Scott Algier, I'm the Executive Director of the Information Technology ISAC. I'd like to invite the team up, Casey, Chloe, Jennifer. Appreciate your coming and joining us today.
Like to be like a runway model here.
Let's do this.
So thank you all. I'll let you introduce yourselves. Don't go down the line.
Sure, so my name's Casey Ellis. I'm the founder and chief strategy officer for BugCrowd. Did not invent vulnerable disclosure or bug bounty, but BugCrowd pioneered the idea of building out a platform that connects all of the talent in the researcher community with all the different problems that we need to solve from a defense standpoint. I'm also co-founder of the Disclose.io project, which is really about vulnerability disclosure, policy standardization, and actually trying to change the legal environment for folk that hack in good faith.
Hi everyone, my name is Chloe Mistagi, and I'm the head of threat intelligence at Hidden Layer. And also I was working with Casey on Disclose.io.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Morell. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Elections Group. I'm also a former local election official, and I lead a team that supports state and local election offices across the country with resources, with training, best practices, all things related to the administration of elections.
Great, thank you all very much. So I'll do a quick introduction into the topic a little bit, talk through why we have these great people joining us today. So the Information Technology ISAC, which I'm the executive director of, established a special interest group, a community of interest, for lack of a better terms, within our membership for elections technology manufacturers, election technology providers, initially so that they can share information about threats that they're seeing. But then we also created a program pretty early on to build a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program within the election industry. The concept being we all want secure election equipment. So how do we build engagement with the security researchers and the companies who make the voting technology? To be honest, when we first started this process, there really wasn't a lot of trust.
They didn't like each other very much.
Right, there wasn't a lot of trust between those two communities. But working with an advisory board that includes Casey, Chloe, and Jennifer, we were able to build some bridges and build that trust among the companies. So it ended up being a 5-year process, which is a long time. But it was also, you need to note that we had COVID in there as well, which set us back a little bit. And the goal was always to have an event where we can provide modern voting technology to a place where security researchers can engage on it and report to the companies in a coordinated vulnerability disclosure process. So under the principles of coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So we had this, we were able to launch this program. Well, we had the event in September 2023. And then today, we released the findings of the event the individual companies who participated, they had they engaged with the researchers and they released their individual reports. All 3 reports are available in this conference report, which was released today. And it's important to note that the equipment that was used was prototype equipment. So it was equipment that is not yet fielded, and we'll talk through why we did that in a minute. But first, the question goes to Chloe, which is, why did we have to reestablish an event such as this when there's already, when researchers are already engaging on voting technology through other forums?
That's a great question. And I would first start with the fact that you brought up trust earlier. It's incredibly important. It's the first build trust. How many of us in this room trust random people, right? Okay, maybe Casey. He's the exception. He's a little biased. And so as you can imagine, going to these election manufacturers and being like, hey, we know you're competitors, but we want to help secure your machines. So that starts one conversation, getting those folks in the room, and then also getting security researchers in the room. And you have to work with other players, such as Bugcrowd, such as HackerOne. And once again, you bring competitors into the room because it's for the greater good. And so you have the DEF CON Voting Village, which is fantastic. Has anyone been to it before? Raise your hand. It's a phenomenal. If you're going DEF CON, make sure to check it out. And we wanted to just expand on that. We didn't want to just have the village and everything. We wanted to try out a pilot program to see if it would work and if we could get people together. And as Scott has mentioned, this was started in 2018, and we finally had the event just last year in the fall of 2023. So that's what I would share. Anyone else want to add on to that?
Well, you know, Chloe, I love the fact that Bo Woods was our MC for this session because when I was going to DEF CON, to the Voting Village, and I was coming there with some of my other election colleagues and some of the voting technology providers, one of the things that really inspired us was the biohacking village that Bo led. And I remember a lot of conversation coming back from those experiences where people said, wow, I wish we had something like the biohacking village for elections. So part of what we did with this forum was try to draw inspiration from other similar events where we thought, well, we would like to do that as well.
I would add to that just a little bit. You know, the thing that so that kind of origin conversation in 2018 was really a House committee group that was assembled to talk about what role people that do security research in good faith could play in securing democracy, full stop, into the future. And it was interesting because in that meeting and at that time, we kind of recognized the fact that the democratic process has 2 challenges. One is obviously the fact that some of it runs on computers and computers have vulnerabilities. Like that's not actually that unique to this industry. It's a thing that's universal, but that is a true statement, and the role that security researchers can play in identifying that is really important. The other is that it has a trust issue. Because ultimately the user base for this product, right, the democratic process is the entire population of the US. And if there's an issue with confidence in the system, we need to do whatever we can to basically provide good explanations around what's being done to make that process safe and secure and like integrate. So that was really where a lot of this kicked off. And I think the thing that was really cool about this event, security research on election systems has been going on for decades, really, at this point in time, in the cyber realm. So we didn't start that or create this process. The thing that I think was exceptional about, the work, obviously, that everyone that put this together did, but also on the manufacturer side, they actually volunteered to actually have that conversation. So it went from being one where it was cats and dogs, researchers finding things and the manufacturers not necessarily knowing how to receive it or wanting to hear it even, to them actually proactively inviting a conversation and getting together in the same room to make that happen. Like that step, I think, was an incredibly powerful one.
Cool. All right, very good. So Jennifer, let's, if you don't mind, to talk about some of the equipment and some of the technology that was brought to the event.
Yeah, well, I'm going to get to that, but you're going to hear a theme in the things that we say today, which Chloe said talked about trust. And we'll talk a lot about that trust, and Casey mentioned that too, between the researchers and the voting technology providers. But we also are cognizant of the trust within the greater election community and not wanting to do anything that would cause harm to those election offices and really even to the voting community as a whole, to build trust with voters. One of our concerns was that if a vulnerability was identified in currently used voting equipment, there would not be enough time to both address that vulnerability and get that upgraded software or hardware through the federal system of testing and certification. So for those of you that don't know, we have an Election Assistance Commission. They set standards. In most states, voting equipment has to be tested against those standards, whether it's new equipment entering the market or upgrades or changes to that equipment. Many states also set their own certification requirements and their own standards that also have to get tested against. And once that happens, there's still something called acceptance testing, where every single piece of equipment in every jurisdiction that upgrade is happening to has to be tested to ensure it's still functioning the way that it's intended. So we knew that if a vulnerability was discovered, there was no way that would be modified in time for this year's election. So with that in mind, we knew we weren't going to be using equipment that was currently in the market, but researchers agreed to bring in equipment that was soon to be released on the market. And most of the hardware that was part of this event is hardware that you would see in a polling location throughout the country today. So we had ballot marking devices, we had ballot scanners, the digital scanners that capture voter intent and tally ballots. We had electronic poll books, the equipment that allows you to check in a voter, ensure that they're registered, issue them a ballot. So the hardware is the same hardware that you would see. The software that was tested is software that's not currently in the market.
Okay, so you appreciate that. So we had the voting technology manufacturers, we had their equipment, but we needed researchers. So how did we do that, Casey?
Yeah, so it was a really interesting sourcing opportunity, I guess. I mean, BugCrowd, for those of you that don't know us, we basically built out a dating website for people to break computers. That's how I describe it sometimes. Almost agnostic of the technology stack or the problem that's trying to be solved on the vendor side. And this is something that we've been doing for 11 years. So like to walk into a net new tech stack and try to figure out who's going to be the best to actually provide security feedback, that's kind of our core competency. But specific to this, I think there was a couple of things that came into it. It is an ecosystem. So I think when people think about election security in general, they're mostly thinking about the voting like touchscreen interface, because that's the thing that everyone touches on election day. It's actually not about that as much. Like, that's a part of a much broader ecosystem. And what we were looking to do is to test as much of that ecosystem and then the relationships between the different bits of equipment, all that kind of stuff, as much of that as we possibly could. So it kind of necessitates a spectrum of skills. We had folks that had really strong hardware expertise. There was definitely a bias towards that. People that understood, API security, web hacking, cloud, infrastructure, kind of you name it. We got a hodgepodge of different skill sets together and put them in the room. The other thing is that this is a really sensitive topic. I think going into this engagement, it's like doing security testing on a private basis is always a thing that you want to be careful in terms of how you talk about it. I think because of the sensitivity of this topic and how potentially flammable it is out there in the market, we were very mindful of who we invited in from that side of things as well. So people just understood that was a factor and something that they needed to navigate in the process. That's kind of how we did that. And I think the other part that was really fun about this event was actually teaching these folk how elections actually work. It's they're hackers that have been breaking stuff this entire time. Actually going through, we had a 101 basically day at the front end of it to help them understand the system, not just the individual bits of technology, but how the election supply chain works and the ecosystem that they're trying to protect here. Watching them walk away with their mind blown, basically, in terms of how this all operates and then the opportunities they have to actually help secure it. I think that was a really valuable kind of aspect of it. So we're kind of looking for people where we suspected that might happen. I think that was a combination of selection and the fact that, you know, the ITI stack and everyone else involved did a really good job of that part.
Well, thank you. On the researcher part as well, I just want to note that it didn't hurt that we had people like you and Chloe and Alex Rice from HackerOne on the advisory board as well to help build those bridges, right? Because if I were to call them up and say, hey, I'm Scott Algier with the ITI SAC, you know, who would take my call, right? So it was nice to have, you know, the credibility of people like you and Chloe and Alex.
Yeah, I mean, our role in that is ultimately as translator, because the reality is that the hacker community, I think, is just universally misunderstood. Like the hacker community that operates in good faith, and we've made progress collectively in understanding that some folk are locksmiths and not burglars. But there's still, I think, this default fear assumption that comes with it. So really the role that we played was, you know, matchmaker, but then basically translator to be able to make sure that the conversations were productive. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. Chloe, let's talk a little bit more about the results of the event, right? And whether we talked a lot about the goal was to help build trust. How did we do? I mean, you engaged a lot with the security researchers. You talked a lot with the companies. How did we do on the trust side?
It was beautiful. Just imagine this. So like Casey just mentioned, like you have to establish trust, and you know, security researchers like, I don't know what I'm walking in here with, and then you have the voting machine folks, and they're like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know what to expect.
And I'm afraid of these.
And I'm afraid of these people. So they walk in like that, perhaps, and they had a scope in place. Let me just say, by the end of one day, they expanded that scope significantly. And it was at the beginning where they're like, please don't break these following things. Then, you know, by the end of it, they shattered everything to find anything they can. And you can imagine if it's their first time seeing this, but like people bringing in their own gear. I know like Casey did a run with a bunch of the researchers to like, what hardware do you guys need? Right. Let's go to Best Buy. And like they just come in like destroying things. But I think like at the very end of the day, you know, since 2018, really hoping that this was going to work and be successful, because there was a lot of pressure. And I just remember all of us debriefing with the researchers and the vendors and the advisor team, and we're all in this room and we asked the researchers, so how was it for you? And they're like, this was probably the hardest thing I had to try to hack into. And all of us looked at each other like,
that's a good start.
That's a great start. That's really nice. I could sleep well tonight.
But it was great because I don't know what the technology providers expected, but I think they were a little worried like this was going to be some sort of circus. And when they realized that the researchers were asking really good questions, really hard questions, and you saw that dialogue sort of happen, that's when we realized, oh, okay, one, this is successful, and we quickly saw the scope, as Chloe mentioned, expand once they realized this is legit. These folks are legit. They know what they're doing, and we actually maybe have something we can learn from them. So that was an exciting moment for me.
It was, I'll add to that in terms of, you know, because it played out over 3 days, and it went from, like, you could literally watch the basically, you know, creation of trust and kind of the collective dropping of shoulders, and then the collaboration that follows that sort of play out over those 3 days. And on the first day, everyone's like, like nervous. It's like, you know, the high school dance where everyone's on the opposite side of the room kind of thing. And, you know, by day two, as Chloe mentioned, like at that point in time, there'd been enough basically establishment of relationship and trust that the manufacturers are like, we actually want more. We actually want to open up scope, like allow you guys to do things that maybe we didn't think that we'd let you do at the outset of this, but because we've started this conversation and because we understand what's going on, we get your intent, all those different things, we're more comfortable with that now. And that just carried forward throughout the 3 days. It was the same on the researcher side as well, because like, you know, you've got to remember that folks with these kind of skills are pretty much constantly afraid of getting their door kicked in because of how hacking is so often misunderstood, right? And this is a pretty hot topic and one where you could expect that kind of blowback if you get it wrong. So they're all walking in thinking, what happens if I do the wrong thing? Am I going to get thrown in jail? Like all that kind of stuff. And that was never the case, but that was their fear, right? So watching them relax over the 3 days was pretty amazing as well.
Yeah, and then you could visibly see the barriers come down, right? A couple hours into when they have access to the machines, the barriers came down, and it became very collaborative, not just between the companies and the security researchers, but within the security researchers, they kind of grouped out, right? And they worked on different equipment in groups based on skill sets.
That was, just adding to that, like that was the other thing that happened, because we run these sort of live hacking events. This was not this is just volunteer effort on Bugcrowd's side and on the researcher side as well, but we do actually run these as a product as well. So we see this happen a lot. The thing that was quite unusual about this was just the level of collaboration. There was researchers like, oh, what do you know? I'm trying to solve this thing. Where are you up to? Could you help out with that? Like, do you know something that I don't? And if we combine that knowledge, we can actually get to the outcome more quickly. The level of that collaboration was like night and day different to what I've seen in other events. And I think the reason for that was they all kind of understood the mission. They came into it and they're like, after that 101, like, this is how this works. These are the kind of risks that we're thinking about from a securing the integrity of democracy standpoint. Once they grok that, they're like, this is really important work. Like, we actually want to really dig into this and make a fundamental difference. And that kind of played out in the collaboration side of things as well.
Anything else?
I would just echo what Casey just said about the greater good. That's what happened in that room. By the time when we were saying our goodbyes to everyone, it hit us like, wow,
cool.
we did something really important for democracy.
And I'll just say too that it wasn't just in that room. It was, again, people on the advisory board who are competitors, people who are SIG member companies who are competitors. Just, the trust that was required and the collaboration that was required across competitors was really phenomenal, and it wouldn't have worked if not for that.
Yeah, put the differences aside.
Put the differences aside, and you would. I mean, not sharing any secrets. I don't think that you and HackerOne are competitors, right? So, but you would never have known it by the way you all collaborated on this advice. And it wasn't just you and Alex; those are your teams working together for this as well. So that's all great. That's all good. Fine. Yay. We did trust, which is really important. But I'm sure people are interested in results. So what was found, and how can people find what was found?
Yeah. So in the report that was dropped this morning, I believe there's links to the different vendors. So there were 4 vendors in the room or in the event. 3, sorry. My bad.
That's okay.
And each of them have published a report. So, coordinated vulnerability disclosure, the idea of that model is that if you've got security research that's going on and you receive an issue, the finder basically says, I'm going to publish this in the interest of public safety within a certain time frame or after you fix the issue. Let's talk about that because I actually want to share this knowledge. So that folks that are subject to that vulnerability downstream can act on it and for the education of the broader kind of hacker and vendor community. So that's why it exists. And everyone who was involved in this event actually signed on to that before it kicked off. It's an important thing to do. I think it's ultimately kind of how the internet's going to work in the future, and we're in the process of seeing that transition right now. It's kind of this backstory behind this T-shirt that I'm wearing right now. They all signed on to that. So what that gives us the opportunity to do is actually read directly in the writing of the researchers what was found. That all dropped today. So I encourage folk to go off and take a look at that if you're interested, because you can actually go through and read this stuff at a technical level. I think the way I'd summarize it is a combination of hardware issues. There was definitely some stuff that was found in terms of like tamper protection and things that could be improved to make these different pieces of equipment more tamper resilient. There was a few basically kind of normal kind of garden variety software issues, but as Chloe mentioned before, there was not a lot of them. I think the overall feedback was like, these are really hard targets. They've actually been built in a way that makes your job as an offensive security researcher quite tough, which is, good news. There were findings, because there always is, and those are in the report. I think the other part that I found really interesting was some findings that related to how election systems are deployed. So it's not so much the something that's under the direct control of the technology manufacturers in the room. It's got to do with how the county actually implements these systems on election day. There were some things that were found in terms of how that was done, which is just as important. You're not talking about a software change at that point. You're talking about a guidance change to actually help everyone who's actually running the vote itself deploy these systems in a way that's more secure. Because you can have a really secure product, but if it's deployed in a way that's insecure, then that's just kind of how it is. So there was some findings related to that as well.
And maybe one thing that I can add, I think most of the vulnerabilities that were identified were categorized as low risk.
Yeah, that's right.
But what was interesting is we got to a point where the researchers said, okay, we understand the compensating controls that would be in place to mitigate or prevent this. But what if there was an insider threat?
Yeah.
And convince the technology providers to give them access as though they were an insider with full access to passwords and systems. And I think that's unique. I don't know, that's been one of the arguments is, giving that full access or looking beyond just the things that would be mitigated through our compensating controls.
Yeah, I think that's an important point as well, right? The compensating controls and both the access, right? You don't. The analogy that I use when we're building this program out is, you don't just. Somebody can't just knock on a nuclear power plant and say, "Hey, I'm a good faith researcher. Give me access, and I'll run."
Please don't do that.
Yeah, right. So and it's critical infrastructure, critical technology. So but then at the end of the day, right? So it's important to know to know who's going on these systems. And in the beginning, people, as you mentioned, were very strict. And at the end, the administrative access, right? And then it helped improve the process, it helped improve the research. So Jennifer, back over to you, right? So we had a really successful event, but what's next, right? So in your mind, right, what would you suggest that the next steps be?
Great. Well, the easy answer is more time. I think everybody agreed. The couple of days that we were there wasn't enough time. We want more time for the researchers. Casey mentioned the education that we did, so we took about half a day, maybe not quite half a day, to really educate the researchers about how elections work, about the testing, the auditing, the operational controls, all the things that are in place so that they could understand that. I think we'd like more time to explore those. Are there better controls that we could have in place? Are the controls that we've relied on for years the right ones? Could we improve those, or are they doing the things that we hope that they would do? I know the researchers wanted more time just in the testing itself. And then we loved at the end of the event having the opportunity to just have open dialogue. I think that's what made this event so unique was this dialogue with these competitors in the room about how to do this better, how to be more transparent, how to continue to improve this. One of the things we haven't mentioned yet is we really tried to socialize this forum. So at the end of the event, members of the media were invited, representatives of some of the national election groups were invited, the Election Assistance Commission, representatives from CISA, legislators. So really trying to bring in some key members in the stakeholder community, kind of socialize this and help them think about how they can support this moving forward. So I suspect next year's version, because I'm going to just say now, we're going to do a next year's version in 2025, probably would expand who those participants are, who those stakeholders are that get to come in towards the end or at some point so they can experience what we did and continue to grow that conversation.
Yeah, I would add to that. The individual vendors actually digging into working more with security researchers in their own ways. I think the collaborative aspect of this was awesome. We did have like vendors that do fight tooth and nail in the market, basically talking about how to break their intellectual property. So there was incredible collaboration on that side of things, but there are kind of obvious limits to that. So I think that's something that they've all pursued, and I think that's going to be potentially part of how we do this next time. There was a lot of talk around the idea of engaging security researchers for threat modeling. So the whole idea of even if you're not hands-on hardware to look for security vulnerabilities, like you're thinking like a bad guy here in ways that we probably can't or don't, because we're building voting equipment, not breaking the internet, right? How can we get more of that thinking in how we design these systems going forward? That was definitely something that came up a bit. And probably the last one is just, we've seen in 2020, CISA published basically guidance for election administrators on how to establish vulnerability disclosure programs. So not necessarily a live hacking event like this one, but the whole idea of saying, hey, like, okay, internet, if you see something, this is how to tell us. Let's just assume that some of you are looking for security issues and some of you might inadvertently stumble across them. Let's make sure that we've got a way to hear that kind of thing when it's found. The different manufacturers kind of followed suit with that later on that year and announced it at DEF CON. So seeing more adoption of that idea across the entire voting technology ecosystem, I think that's a big part of what we're seeing kind of roll out from here.
Anything from your end, Chloe?
I just look forward to having something where what they both shared, and to just keep moving forward and get more voting machine vendors to participate, and really getting more security researchers involved, and just making this kind of a standard or a standard practice before every election. I think that'd be really a really good thing for us.
Yeah, okay, right, and I think this is a nice segue into kind of the next topic, which for everybody is, so what do we need to do to make this like the standardized, right? So are there any obstacles we need to overcome? We have this trust. There's interest within the companies to continue engagement with the security researchers. The security researchers who participated were ecstatic and expressed interest. So what obstacle? I know. What do we need to overcome in order to make this a routine event?
Word of mouth. You're all here. You're all participating in this panel. There's a report that's out. Spread the word. I think that's like the #1 priority. Like, if this is not shared, then nothing's going to change. It's going to be harder to push things forward. So word of mouth is incredibly important, especially from like everyone in this room, because you work in cybersecurity. Trust is something important. Your voice matters, and that's why we need you to help share it out.
I think there's probably a policy discussion in there as well, which, dang it, we always have these great ideas and then policy sometimes gets in the way. But I think there is an opportunity to think and look more at the current testing system that we have in place, and probably look to the private sector. It shouldn't take months or years to fix a vulnerability. There should be a way that if we're going to host a program like this, we need to also think about how do we make it effective once those vulnerabilities are discovered. So how do we help those technology companies quickly make those changes and get those new systems or that updated software into the election community where it's needed. So I think there's probably a hard policy discussion.
Can I pull on that thread just a little bit?
Yeah.
So the standard, so to speak, is a vulnerability is disclosed, you work with the researcher 90 days, you issue a fix, right? And then that fix is deployed and everyone lives happily ever after. But why is that model not appropriate to the elections industry?
Because there's always an election somewhere in the country on any given day, some jurisdictions in the middle of their election. So we have to sort of balance that public trust factor it's tough.
Well, I do think that part, because that's exactly why. I do think that part actually becomes less of an issue. We've seen this across a whole bunch of different industries. Through the 12 years now that I've been working on BugCrowd. The more this stuff is talked about transparently, like vulnerabilities happen because humans write code. They're not because people are terrible or whatever else. Like it's a function of human creativity not being perfect, and sometimes that resulting in an exploitable condition. And that doesn't give us a pass, but it means that when we're talking about it, it's not this the closer you can get to having a conversation around this type of thing that looks like that, I think at that point in time, the discussion becomes less easy to weaponize. From a information warfare standpoint, it becomes less touchy, which means you could just get on with making these systems more secure. I think the normalization aspect of this, like we've seen that be very, very powerful in a whole bunch of other industries, including some that were like pretty touchy in similar ways. I think this is by far the most sensitive and on that side of things, but there's others that have been on a similar scale that have actually successfully navigated that.
Right.
And I would just add, Casey, vulnerability doesn't mean exploitation, right?
Yeah.
So I think, again, there's one of the ways that we navigate this sort of trust minefield with elections happening all the time is to learn from these experiences about the audits that we do, about the testing we do in election offices, about the operational controls, and really understand if this vulnerability was exploited, are these enough to prevent something terrible from happening or from an outcome being changed? And I think that's also an important part of the conversation when we want to make this the norm, because we're never going to get away from, in any given day, there's an election running somewhere.
Yeah, I think, Scott, going back to your question before on how we can make this more normal and how we can do more of it, I think the two bits I'd add there is just trying to work towards making it less episodic. Like election security as a subject always boils up, 12 months before a general election. A bunch of stuff happens, we all try to work out what to do next, and then everyone kind of needs a break for a little while, and it goes quiet for 2 years until it pops up again, right? And in the meantime, new kits being developed and pushed out there, elections are still running. I think finding ways to make it less, I've been working on this problem since 2016, so I've seen a couple of cycles of that here, as somewhat obviously a non-American native. And that's just kind of how it works. So I think trying to find ways to make it a consistent process, not one that relies on there being a trash fire around this subject out there in the public eye, I think that's really important. The other, just really quickly, is finding ways to pay the researchers. Because I think, working off their mission drive and the altruism and all the things we kind of use to make this event happen, that's great. The work they're doing is really valuable, and they could be doing other things. I think making it more consistent does involve finding ways to actually compensate them for that. And I think, that's an addition to this that we should probably be thinking about as we go forward.
Yeah, okay, so there's a lot there in everything in that conversation there. But I guess one point I think worth noting is that just if there's the date of the election, right, but then working backwards, there are dates when you can't access the machines, right? So it's 60, 90 days, I don't know, depending on jurisdictions and their policies, where you can't make any adjustments to the technology. So plus you have the 90 days we've already discussed. So the timeline does become pretty tight when it comes to, plus there are elections all the time. And one conversation or hypothetical conversation perhaps, and depending on who you are, your answer might differ, right? Is it better to know about a vulnerability on a machine and use it, or is it better to not know right? And it depends, right, on what because go out and say, yeah, there was vulnerabilities on the machine, we knew about them, but we didn't fix them, right? Well, then that's not a great answer for some people, right? So it's a really complicated space for us, and to apply this CVD model, it's really, it's a really unique industry to do this because of some of the nuances. So Chloe, let's start with you. We have 10 minutes left. We'll do one round here on key takeaways. What's the most important takeaway for you and for each of the other panelists, and then we'll open up for questions. So what's your key takeaway?
Kumbayas exist, okay? They do. This is an example and on an issue that has a lot of tension, so it definitely exists. And other than that, just off topic, please register to vote.
Yeah.
Like seriously, go out to register to vote. Get your friends, your families registered to vote. If you don't know what to do, how to go about that, go to vote.org. It has all that information. But honestly, if you are in cybersecurity, please also think about volunteering at your polling place, or better yet, maybe work at that polling place, because we should be involved in it too with the public. We want the public to start trusting us in the hacker space and cybersecurity space. You being there is going to help. So please be part of the democracy, and please get out and vote.
Jennifer?
Sure. So this event took a lot of courage, took a lot of gentle persistence. I wish Jack Cable was here because he embodies gentle persistence for me. And it was about not letting perfect get in the way of starting something and doing something good. Just like in everything we do around elections, there's no one silver bullet for protecting and securing elections. There are many, many, many layers, many, many controls in place to ensure that our elections are secure, they are resilient, and this to me is just one more piece of that puzzle as we move towards a better place for elections and democracy generally.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that security research on election systems is happening whether we invite it or not. That's how the internet works. So, like working with that phenomena and actually deciding to partner with it, and then using that as a way to not only receive security feedback, but then develop this story of transparency that ultimately goes to creating confidence in the voting population. I think that's to me really what we're trying to do here. And I think it's really just important to kind of repeat that and call it out, because ultimately, this is going to come up again. Like voting infrastructure is going to change. There's, I think, 70% of the world is having an election within the next 12 months. So this is not just a US issue. It's one of the reasons I got involved as an Aussie, because if there's problems here, they are going to trickle downstream to my home country, even though we're not necessarily using the same infrastructure or equipment. This is actually about making sure that the democratic process itself stays intact, and I think that's a really important mission. So thinking about the problem that we're trying to solve here in that way, and not just we're finding bugs, we're trying to get dogs and cats to play nice. I think those are kind of the things that we've used to feed up into that bigger mission. And I think just repeating the fact that that's why we're talking about this in the first place is important.
Awesome, great, thank you. So we do have some time for questions. If you have one, I've been asked to ask people to please use the microphones. The session's being recorded. So if you would like to queue up behind the mic, go ahead.
Hi, just I don't know if it's an easy question, but how do you keep any thoughts on how you keep the normal process of vulnerability disclosure itself from becoming a political tool when vulnerabilities are disclosed?
Go, Casey.
Whoa.
It's your birthday.
Yeah, I have many thoughts on that. I mean, this took, what was it, 5 years?
5 years.
Yeah. So the starting point of this conversation was in that House committee meeting that I mentioned, and basically the thing that popped out was, we don't need to think about vulnerability disclosure or even security research on these systems because they're locked up all year round except for when they come out for an election. At which point I pulled out my phone, brought up eBay, and showed a voting machine that I'd bought off eBay that week, and kind of called out the fact that all I need to do as a bad guy is make that look like it's been infected with ransomware, and then tweet that in the right locations, and I'm potentially influencing voter turnout and the outcome of the election at that point. So there's a transparency problem that we're trying to address by doing this, as well as a cybersecurity one. It's inherently political. There's no way to avoid the political side of it. It's actually been an interesting aspect of working on this as a non-American, because I get to kind of just be rooting for the democratic process and not anything from a partisan standpoint. That's always difficult, and I think it's just a part of navigating an incredibly complex and important space.
Yeah, super. Thank you for that question. Yeah, it's. I think that's a good answer. I think everyone has an interest in these secure technology. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I think part of the challenge is how we utilize the technology, because really, when you use technology in elections, there's only a couple of reasons to do it. Number one, increase the trust and the accuracy, and number two, increase the time. The closest election we've had in the last 100 years was in 1960, and they figured that out by noon the next day with basically chalkboards and paper ballots. So now we're infusing all the technology you're talking about, and everything you mentioned here, 98.7% of the people have no idea what you're talking about. How are you going to, and how is what you're working on going to increase it? Because from my vantage point, going back to paper and chalkboards sounds a lot better than where we are because of the trust factor. And if technology can't fix the trust, or it can't fix the timing, why are we going through this effort?
So chalkboards and paper are not better. They do seem better. I know in some recent tests, there have been some jurisdictions across the country that have experimented with hand counting. And humans also are vulnerable. Humans also are really bad, actually, at tedious, repetitive tasks and doing math. So that's part of the reason we use technology. But to the question you're asking, I think we continue to try to educate people. Election officials, again, state and local, I think they're doing a bang-up job. You're right. It's not getting to the audience it needs to be. I see better websites. I see tours of offices. I see engagements with media. I see videos. I see all of these things on social media. It's still not getting to the place where most of the constituents, most of the voters in the country are feeling comfortable about their understanding of the process and the process itself. So, but it can't just be an election official problem. It's got to be all of our problem. It needs all of us sort of working together to educate one another.
Okay, yeah, it seemed like in the results you were indicating that it was more hardware issues found overall than software. Does that imply that physical access would be needed more so often, and you're not as worried about remote access or anything like that?
No, like from a threat model standpoint, no. Definitely worried or thinking about both, and that was actually a part of the 101. Talking about here's the overall ecosystem, here are some of the compensating controls that exist in a regular vote. Here's how to focus or think about focusing your efforts on maximum impact as a bad guy, right? That's kind of the charter that we put out there. There was definitely remote and kind of network based priorities kind of set out in that. The hardware piece, I think, really what it comes down to is that can always be improved. Like actually physically tampering with, a voting device, for example, like in a poll booth, that's going to be quite difficult because you need time, you need stealth, and like the ability to actually influence the outcome by doing that's limited because you've only got one machine that you're interacting with. So as a scaled attack from an adversary that wants to change the outcome of an election, that's not how you do that, basically. But there were things that came out on that side. I think more broadly, we didn't do a lot of testing on things like web-borne, like the relationship between the DMV and voter registration systems, for example. Like that wasn't in scope of this particular engagement because the DMV wasn't in the room, right? There are different things like that I think pop out that is part of what we should be looking at from a continuing research standpoint.
Yeah, and the full event report is available itisac.org /EISIG, or the Elections Industry SIG page on the ITISAC site, and that links to all of the reports from the companies who participated. So itisac.org, and then on the Elections Industry SIG, and you can see what the voting technology providers produced.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, just a quick follow-up is, did you get any sense of how often they're doing updates? Was it different per manufacturer?
Do you want to speak to that?
It's going to vary. So are you talking about updates to the vulnerabilities that were identified? I don't know Because this is all equipment,
it's
software that's not in the market
it's
yet.
pre-deployed equipment.
Right, so it's pre-deployment. Nobody has this, nobody's using this in their office. I don't know what the time frame is.
In general, that's going to vary on the products, like the amount of time that's involved in regression testing for deployment of a fix. I think in the wild, you've got the EAC recertification process that you might trigger as a part of this process. So the answer is it depends, which I'm sorry.
So, yeah, I say 13. Yeah, okay, real quick, and then we have to go.
Yeah, I just want to say, I wanted to challenge that idea a little bit that affecting a single voting machine might not affect an outcome of an election. We routinely have elections that are coming down to 1,000 votes, right? So you could see a single machine impacting that.
Yeah, what I wasn't saying is that that's an insignificant problem or an insignificant risk. What I was saying there is that if, as a scaled adversary, I wanted to change the entire outcome, that's not where I'd start.
Super. Well, they've been on lots of meetings with me. They know I never end on time, but I did today. So thank you all for joining us. Appreciate your time today. Thank you, Casey, Chloe, Jennifer.